A former Republican National Convention senior official told Rolling Stone magazine that Donald Trump plans to run for office again. At least, that's what he's told dinner friends in recent months. We have to take this report with a grain of salt, but if Trump does plan to run, there's good evidence that the primary nomination is his for the taking.
So far, GOP straw polls put Trump in the lead. But Florida Governor Ron Desantis has made headway among voters. We have the first 2024 GOP primary poll from Hill-HarrisX. Let's take a look.
Stand before you today to declare that the incredible journey we begun together, we went through a journey like nobody else. There's never been a journey like it. There's never been a journey so successful. We began it together 4 years ago, and it is far from being over. We've just started.
Trump's in the lead in 2024 primary preference among GOP voters at 56%. Former Vice President Mike Pence comes in second with 28% of the vote, followed by Ron DeSantis and Ted Cruz, both with 19% of the vote. Rachel, I'm actually curious, how serious are you taking the rumors about Trump becoming Speaker if Republicans take the House as kind of a platform to then launch his second bid on the back of the impeachment articles he would no doubt file as his first act?
Hey, you do not have to be a member of Congress to be Speaker of the House.
Every reporter says that every 2 years. This, though, is the first time it's actually perhaps relevant.
I would suspect that if Trump is going to once again hold public office, he's got eyes on the prize. He wants to go straight back to the Oval. But, these numbers are early, obviously, but it's interesting to look at them now sort of in the context of internal Republican politics, right? Nobody wants to get ahead of Trump. Trump is still the most popular politician in the Republican Party. You can see that from the polling, back up on the screen. Base Republicans still really love him. And so that, I think, is restraining. That and the fact that he's not ruling out running again is really restraining, would-be successors from moving forward and sort of throwing their hat in the ring. Nobody wants to get publicly smacked down by Trump either. Right. So I do think that that's a big dynamic at work.
I feel like there's a way in which the business class, the business wing of the Republican Party is actually okay with this situation, even as they whine about how gauche Trump is and they don't this and that. In this scenario, the business wing of the Republican Party does well when Republicans control Congress, but there's a Democrat in the White House. Like, in some ways, that's an ideal situation for them. They're going to, taxes and regulations are going to be kept low. There's going to be some tiny amount of enforcement they're going to have to deal with here and there from the Democratic White House, but their hands are really tied. So there's not much to fear, and functionally, the government is going to run, as smoothly as an American government can run, which is not that smoothly, but it's, better than, say, the chaos they were dealing with under the Trump administration. And so to have Trump in the lead for them, likely sets up a scenario where, they're fine with either of the outcomes. They're going to get a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House, most likely, because of, Trump's toxicity in the suburbs, or they get a Republican Congress and a Trump in the White House, and then they get, massive tax cuts again.
Yeah. I do think Trump is a wild card, though, right? He's not nearly as predictable as I think some office holders would be. We know this now from experience. And I do think, what was interesting is that Trump's more sort of heterodox beliefs, on trade, where he sided more with Democrats, his rhetorically at least, positioning, wanting to take on, big business and big pharma, was undermined in a lot of ways, I think, from the right's perspective, by some of the people that he brought into the White House. So I am curious if he does get another run at it and actually hires an effective staff. Now, I don't know that he will.
Why
because
would he do that?
Right, he sort of seems to really love the chaos. He loves
Yes.
sort of people, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired.
Yeah.
But I do think maybe the business community is a little bit, gun shy of that happening, because I do think, he didn't walk exactly, at least rhetorically, the line that traditional Republican candidates have in the past.
Right, and I think that's right. I don't think they want him to win, but with him being at the top and him being the candidate, I think they're more likely to get the outcome that they do like. But it's interesting because while Trump was rhetorically good on some of the things that you're talking about, you're right that he didn't execute terribly well on some of them. But what he did is he kind of fueled the progressive wings of the Democratic Party that also were skeptical of trade, skeptical of concentrated power, anti-monopoly. And it finally allowed them to say, look, we've been saying this for years, and you corporate Democrats have been ignoring us. And by ignoring us, you not only made the world a worse place, but the cardinal sin that you committed is that you've now allowed Republicans to claim the mantle of trade and skepticism of big business. So that then internally empowered them. And I think seeing Jonathan Cantor named to the Department of Justice is not completely unrelated to that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Trump was clarifying in this regard, right? He sort of made it known, that there was some sort of groundswell of support for, taking on these issues, that the corporatist elements in D.C. were really frustrating to people on both the right and the left. So whoever sort of takes the mantle, I think, coming forward, both Democrats and Republicans, that's got to be a key element that I'm not really convinced national parties are paying attention to still.
Yeah, for sure. So in Iowa, Politico reports that Pence was met with a meager response from supporters. This comes just weeks after the CPAC conference where he was heckled and called a traitor during a speech on stage. Let's roll that clip.
Well, hello, America. It is great to be back with so many patriots dedicated to faith and freedom and the road to the majority. And I want to thank my friend Ralph Reed for those overly generous words. I'm deeply humbled by them. Ralph Reed knows me well enough to know the introduction I prefer is a little bit shorter. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order, and I am honored to stand before you today.
What's that got to be like for him?
Mike Pence has been around a long time, and I think he has got to step out now and define himself, right? He was known sort of as a congressman and then vice president under the shadow of Trump, and that is still kind of haunting him. People view him there's a segment of the Republican Party that still views him as a barrier, right? Or a ball and chain, if you want to call it that, to the Trump agenda. And it's interesting to even hear him in that clip when he says, I'm a Christian, a conservative, a Republican, in that order. I've been in politics for 15 years now. I think I've heard that 1,500 times from Mike Pence. And so I think it's really incumbent on him to sort of define himself, his policy platform, and who he is, separate and apart from Donald Trump, and also his long career as a congressman.
But aren't his whole entire politics superfluous at this point? I mean, Trump needed Pence, or he thought he needed Pence in 2016, in order to bring the evangelical community behind him. They are now behind him. They are Trump's. They are not Pence's, as has been demonstrated over and over again. And so this idea that in order to win over evangelicals, you need to be Christian, conservative, and then Republican is outdated.
Yeah.
You flip that. The way to get evangelicals is to be a Trump Republican first. Trump, I suppose he's like nominally a Christian. Nobody views him in that way, yet he has their unquestioning loyalty.
It's a great point about Pence, and even if you go down the line, of the other Republicans in the race, because you're right, for so long that defined Republican politics was this appeal to, traditional values and evangelicals. And this doesn't exist anymore. Trump blew that calculus out of the water. And, as happens with so many national parties, after something like that happens, we're still sort of peeling back the wreckage. You have a whole consultant class that's been built up around what Mike Pence is doing, that hasn't quite adapted. And, I'm curious how it affects, too, the other candidates. Because if you look down this list, you have Pence, you have, Desantis, Cruz, Haley, Pompeo. All of them are in that vein, but they're going to have to step out, and I think redefine themselves, not just policy-wise, but again, to get elected as a Republican in this country post-Trump is going to look different and sound different than it did, even 10 years ago.
And I'm curious for your take on this because you follow this more closely, but every study of populism around the globe has shown that at the center of it, you always have a leader who makes a direct connection with his or her people, usually his, but sometimes her people. And so it lacks any kind of ideological consistency because of that, because it's this one-to-one relationship. And so Trumpism, by that definition, is not an ideology. It's not a politics. Trumpism is Trump. And so anybody who tries to kind of replicate it or reproduce it in a Senate race, like a J.D. Vance or something,
right,
is going to come off as a pretender because there isn't necessarily a coherent ideological project that Trump came up with and then delivered to people. What Trump delivered to people is id and his own unique celebrity. He's been a famous person in America for 40 or 50 years, and there are very few people kind of who fit that category. So if it's not an ideological project and it's actually organized around Trump himself, then what does that say for the rest of those people who are down underneath him on that list?
So I do think Trump obviously changed the Republican Party. I think there are elements of populism there, that sort of strongman scenario that you're talking about. But what I do really think it is much bigger than that, in the sense that I think this has been an ongoing problem in the Republican Party, that its elite leaders have been so separated from its base. And, in the Tea Party even, right? Mm-hmm. People in the Tea Party love to say it was just about deficit spending. It wasn't. It was about mass amnesty. Right. It was about Obamacare. It was about so much more. But ultimately, it was about the base of the Republican Party not feeling heard, by its leadership. And that Tea Party was a shot across the bow that nobody listened to, right? And so when Trump came around, they were willing to be convinced that he was going to go in and blow the system up. So it's that I think the Republican Party is still trying to deal with, because I do think it's bigger than the personality of Trump. The Republican Party is grasping for a policy agenda to meet the real needs, that the grassroots feels, and that has to be reflected in a policy agenda more so than it does a personality, and that's what we're really struggling with. I am, hopeful that we'll see candidates that really can grasp that, but we're in a period of change, and that always looks messy.
And it was most certainly not about the deficit. We have definitely learned that.